Thank you very much, Kieran, and thank you to Jay and colleagues at Understanding Society for hosting this brilliant conference and inviting me to come along and talk about some of the work that we've done using this great data source, particularly the longitudinal elements of this brilliant data source, to explore the relationship between commuting behaviours, travel behaviours, and people's health and well-being. So it's me speaking today, but this is very much a team effort. So just some acknowledgements first. So the ESRC funded the majority of the research I'll talk about today under a secondary data analysis grant. And my colleagues at Sheffield, Professor Jenny Roberts, and at York, Professor Nigel Rice, were very much involved in all of this as well as Nikita Jacob, who was a researcher on this project. So I'm going to talk about two papers that we've done using Understanding Society from this grants award. And I was looking back through my notes, and the first paper was actually presented at the Understanding Society Scientific Conference in 2015, which seems a long time ago now, but that conference was brilliant for shaping the direction of this research, and we tweaked the questions based on that conference, and the feedback was absolutely invaluable. So just a general overview, what is commuting and why is it important from a research point of view? So commuting can be thought about as the interaction between where people live and where they work. This is really important because in economics, the housing and labour markets are two of the biggest contributors to the economy, gross domestic product. But they're also very strongly related to people's living standards. So essentially, these are the two big areas of people's lives that have a considerable amount of importance placed upon them. From an economics point of view, commuting is being studied quite extensively, mainly from a theoretical position, but it's being considered by two distinct types of economists. So labour economists typically look at the relationship between commuting and labour market outcomes, so jobs, type of jobs, wages, etc., and almost ignore the housing and the urban markets. Conversely, urban economists assume the labour market is in equilibrium, they don't really care about that, and look at the choices people make about where they live and characteristics of the houses. But obviously we need to try and bring all of this together in some way. Some people have argued that commuting is a choice, so people make decisions about where to live and work, and that rational individuals, again from an economics background, should only engage in this behaviour, this choice variable, this commuting activities, if they are somehow compensated for it. So that compensation can come from higher wages, better job security, increased or improved working conditions, etc. Or it could come from better quality housing, nicer neighbourhoods, or some combination of those factors. Time that we spend commuting, travelling to and from work, can't be done on other activities. There are some exceptions. You could think about if you walk to work, that might be a nice leisure activity, depending on where you live and work. But generally, the time we spend commuting is time that we can't spend earning money by working, or we can't spend relaxing and enjoying social activities or whatever we do in our leisure time. And as I'll show on the next slide, this really is a non-trivial use of time. It's increased over time. And just to clarify here, in this presentation, we're going to focus on people aged 16 to 65, and only on people who are employees. We're going to drop the self-employed because it's been shown that they have different commuting patterns to people in employment. So this is commuting time during Understanding Society, so from 2009-10 up to 2017-18. As you can see, it's increased from about 26 minutes up to about half an hour. And this is one way. So that means essentially the average person in Understanding Society is commuting for about an hour every day. And that hour, as we've said, can't be spent doing other things. It's a substantial part of the day. Think about it. People typically work 8 hours, 7.5, 8 hours. So it's about an eighth of a standard working day. Majority of people use car, or vans or similar, but there is about 15% of people who use public transport, and about the same who use what we would determine or what we would call active modes, such as walking and cycling. And that's been about constant across the 10 waves of understand society. So this only goes up to wave 7 because that's what was in the paper. But it's about 70% of people using cars and 15% using both public transport and active travel. And there's substantial variation in commuting time by mode, as we'd expect. So people who use public transport commute much longer, and active commuters on average commute relatively shorter distances. All of this research predates the pandemic. Obviously, the pandemic changed quite a lot of people's lives. And during the pandemic, people realised that they weren't commuting. People who were lucky enough to keep their jobs were working from home. And there's all sorts of estimates. So people argued that by not commuting to work, we gained an extra 9 days. And there's some estimates in London that the commuting savings were about half a year's wage in London. So these are considerable amounts of time and money that commuting imposes on us. And the pandemic shone some light on what we could do if we weren't commuting. Obviously, I'm not saying the pandemic is generalisable. We want to try and get back to some sort of normality, but it really did help to shine a light on the role of commuting and how long people spend doing it. Commuting can affect many aspects of our lives. So as I've said, where we live, where we work. It's also got financial costs. It's typically expensive to use public transport or to get a car and to use petrol and diesel, particularly at the moment. But also places an opportunity cost. As I've said, we can't use the time we are commuting to do other things that we might enjoy doing instead. Particular angle that we're going to focus on here is people's health and well-being. And particularly we're going to focus on the well-being consequences of commuting time and the health effects of commuting mode. And we're going to try and quantify some of the relationships here, but I think it is important to stress that we need to get, in quotes, good estimates that we are confident are generalisable and can be meaningful for policymakers and practitioners. So I think this is where understanding society is such a great data set, the longitudinal nature and the huge sample sizes that it has. But just to sort of hopefully remind everyone why longitudinal data is really useful to use here. So we're interested between the relationship between commuting behaviours and health and well-being. Understand society is great because it's got a whole suite of other socioeconomic and demographic and socioeconomic characteristics that we can account for or control for as well, that we know are going to influence this relationship. But without longitudinal data, there is a real worry that this might be sort of a bidirectional or reverse causal relationship. So is commuting behaviour affecting people's health, or is an individual's level of health impacting the decisions they're making about commuting mode? And without being able to disentangle this complicated relationship, we could get potentially spurious correlations or fall foul of the post hoc fallacy. And I think this is really where the longitudinal nature of understanding society is so good, because it does allow us to study changes within an individual over time. So, as we say, I'll talk about 2 different papers where we look at changes in locations of the firm and changes in commuting mode. So the first paper is really trying to look at the relationship between commuting time and people's well-being. And as the title suggests, we do find gender differences, and we try to look at why that might be. So again, just to reiterate this from an economics point of view, the logic is people shouldn't commute or long commute if they aren't compensated through employment and or housing factors. So we're going to use well-being as a proxy for utility, but actually well-being is far more than a proxy for utility. It's got its own important characteristics. The paper develops a theoretical model that's based on a number of assumptions that's going to allow us to test this compensation argument. So are people compensated for increases in commuting time? And then as we're going to show, the effects differ by individual and area level characteristics. And that's really important to understand, because the relationship isn't the same across people. It does differ very much by people and place-based characteristics. So how can commuting time affect well-being? So as I've said, we've got this competing use of time argument, but it can just be quite stressful on its own. So for example, if you're driving to work and it's congested, that can be quite a stressful experience. Or if we've been on a train when it's overpacked or crowded, that is very detrimental to our well-being. It's a very stressful experience. There is some evidence that commuting time can be positive for well-being. So for example, particularly via active modes, if we are walking or cycling, you can sort of switch off, enjoy the scenery, and really disentangle work from home. But then commuting, the decisions we make about commuting does affect potentially the types of jobs that are available. If we want to pick a house in a nice area, or if we want to pick a job, it could limit the type of house that are available to people. So as I said, we're going to develop a model to try and analyze this relationship. And the key underpinning assumption is that an individual's well-being or their utility is affected positively by their job characteristics. So wages, better jobs, more secure jobs, better flexibility are positively associated with well-being. And housing characteristics such as the size of the house, the location, the general state of repair are also positively predictive of well-being. But commuting is negatively associated with well-being. And then this compensation comes through by the job and our housing characteristics. The key hypothesis we want to test is if everything else is held constant but commuting time increases, what happens to an individual's well-being? And our underlying hypothesis is that there should be no change in well-being if the compensation is sufficient to offset the detriment caused by an increase in commuting time. But to be able to test this model, we need good quality longitudinal data. So we need the same people interviewed in multiple time points, and that allows us to sort of model away some individual specific characteristics through the inclusion of fixed effects. So people's personalities, for example, their preferences over where they work and where they live assumed to be fixed with an individual, and repeated observations on the same people allow us to sweep those out of the estimation. But then crucially, we need also to observe some unexpected or exogenous change to somebody's commuting time that is beyond the control of an individual. So we're going to try and look at something that would cause an unexpected shock to an individual's commuting time that they can't really control. But crucially, everything else should be held constant. And this is where understanding society really does help. So our idea is to use people who don't move house or change the household characteristics. So they live in the same house in the same place and they haven't done substantial work to their property. People have the same job for the same employer with roughly the same characteristics, but their commuting time between waves has changed by some threshold. And the majority of the work is going to concentrate on an increase of 5 minutes or more, but we also show that it's quite robust to other changes in commuting time as well. So as I said, Understand Society is the perfect data set to allow us to do this, because we know people are asked when they move and why they've moved. So if that's unapplicable or people haven't moved, we can identify that. Through the really good special license versions of the data, we can obtain quite granular geographical information. So we use lower layer super output areas, LSOAs. And we can use the self-reported information on housing characteristics, such as the number of rooms, whether there's a garden, a usable garden, central heating type, etc. So we can make sure that somebody lives in the same house by using the responses to these questions. Understand Society also collects brilliant information about people's jobs and their employment. People are asked when did they start their new job and if they've got a new employer, or when did they start the new employment. So again, we can use this to ensure that between successive survey waves, an individual hasn't got a new job for a new employer. There's also information on standard occupational classifications, and that we can use to make sure it is the same job, and also self-reported wage data as well, that we can make sure there hasn't been some sort of internal promotion that might affect well-being as well. And then as commuting time questions are asked in each wave, we can look at the difference between wave T and wave T plus 1. So these three general bits of information really help us to create quite a nice estimation sample here. So we're going to keep people who have the same household and the same household characteristics. They have the same job, the same employer, but their commuting time has increased by more than 5 minutes to start with. We then argue that that change to commuting time is either caused by changes in transport infrastructure, so there's a new road or a new rail network, or the firm has relocated. But that typically is being shown to be outside of individuals' control, and firm relocation decisions are announced quite late. So we argue that this will be sort of exogenous to an individual. So we can see we've got a really nice big sample size. Then when we apply the various restrictions, we still get left with over 15,000 people and about 56,000 observations. So even after these quite restrictive assumptions are imposed, the size of Understand Society really helps us to keep a big enough sample that we can look at the associations and the causal effects over time, but also do this by subgroups. So we can try and explore who's being affected and potentially why. So the main measure of well-being that we use is from the General Health Questionnaire, which is a series of 12 questions, which are designed to identify minor psychiatric disorders and investigate general psychological health within a general population. Each of the 12 questions is answered on a 0 to 3 scale, so the maximum possible value is 36. And we reverse code that so that higher values of the GHQ correspond to better or higher levels of well-being. And the questions are on this slide here. So people are asked to think back over the last few weeks and to think, have they recently been able to concentrate? Have they lost much sleep, over worry? Are they capable of making decisions? Are they able to face up to problems, etc.? And these are typically answered on a more so than usual, same as usual, less than usual, and much less than usual type of scale. And as I say, we reverse code this, so 36 is the theoretical best level of well-being, and 0 is the theoretical worst level of well-being. So this is the summary statistics for our estimation sample of the 15,846 individuals. So the mean GHQ score is about 25.2, which is common for a general population, so it's very much towards the top of the range, so much closer to 36 than it is to 0. The demographics are broadly consistent with the whole sample and of the population more generally. So there's nothing odd that we can see from these summary statistics. It seems quite representative. It's just that these people have experienced some exogenous shock to their travel time that means they now have to commute either at least 5 minutes longer or at least 5 minutes shorter. And essentially, these are the key results. So we estimate a fixed effects or a within-person regression on the selected sample of people whose commuting time has changed, given their other characteristics have remained the same. So we're interested in this parameter beta here. So from the whole sample, there is a negative and statistically significant relationship between increase in commuting time and well-being. So if the shock led to an increase in your commuting time, you are likely to report a lower level of well-being after that shock. But then we drill down by females and males, we can see this is essentially all driven by a bigger and more statistically significant reduction for females, and there's no significant effect for males. Essentially, this overall effect is very much driven by females. So females are much more likely to say their well-being has deteriorated following an increase to their commuting time. We did a series of robustness checks to make sure our results were not sensitive to various assumptions we'd made. So we wanted to make sure that people were moving around between lots of survey waves. So we stipulated in the most extreme case that a person must have had the same house and job for at least 5 years before the shock happened. We also varied and did it 1, 2, 3, 4 years. But even in the most restrictive case, so somebody had a very stable household location, a very stable job, and the results weren't sensitive to that. So it wasn't really driven by people moving job, moving house quite a lot. We looked at whether there was financial compensation. So in the main regressions, we held constant income, so we included it as a covariate. Then we further restricted to the sample whose income didn't change between plus or minus 5% between consecutive survey waves. And again, the results were incredibly robust. Although interestingly, the larger effects seem to be for people who had below the median income. So people on high incomes were less affected than people on relatively smaller incomes. Shift workers didn't really explain this result either, because we know shift workers, although they might have the same commuting time, they travel in different circumstances at different times of the day, but the results weren't driven by that. We use larger definitions for the shock, so we also included that the change between waves had to be at least 10 minutes and then at least 15 minutes, and again the results were very robust to that. And again, just to make sure this wasn't a result of people moving around between various different ways, we looked at this idea of an absorbent shock. So to avoid this misreporting, so say if your true commuting time was 12 minutes in 1 year, you were likely to say it was 10, and the next it was 15, and then 10. We basically made sure that the new commuting time following the shock had to be maintained for at least 2 and then 3 years post the shock. So this was a true change to commuting time. It wasn't a misreporting error that people were rounding up and rounding down in different years. And again, the results were incredibly robust to that as well. So the key question that came out of this, well, why is it that females are affected and not males? So we had a series of hypotheses, and we tried to test these using the data. So anecdotally, we know that females have the largest share of childcare responsibilities and household tasks within a household. When we looked at the effects based on the age of children, whether or not people had children, women who had children 0 to 4, so young children, had the biggest detriment to their well-being following a shock to their commuting time. There's also effects for people who had children 5 to 15 years, but they were smaller than for the younger age children. We also know that females are more likely to work part-time, and therefore commuting is a bigger part of their working day, if we think of commuting time as part of the working day. But we find that the larger effects are actually for full-time women rather than part-time women. And again, to try and unpick this household tasks and who does what within the household, we compared single women to single men, with the idea that people in a one-person household should have to do the same household tasks, regardless of whether they're female or male. But actually, we found that single females were still much more detrimentally impacted than single males. So maybe it wasn't a household task, or at least it wasn't a purely household task argument that was explaining this. And also, single females have a bigger effect or bigger relationship between commuting time and well-being than married or cohabiting females. So maybe that isn't fully explaining this. So we then went back to the labour economics literature and looked at this idea of a thin labour market. So essentially, the thinness of a labour market can be characterised by the number of vacancies within an area divided through by the employment count. So unemployment count, sorry. So how many jobs are there? How many people are there looking for jobs? And does that matter? We did that by male and female at local authority district level. And there's some literature that argues that there's a gender segregation that exists within the labour market. So even if males and females live in the same geographical areas, they operate in very different labour markets. And people have tried to explain this looking at primary versus secondary wage earners within a household, and also the allocation of tasks within a household as well. And essentially, if we classify labour markets as thin, so less than the 25th percentile, or tight above the 75th centile, the argument is that it should be easier to secure a job in a tight labour market. So there are more vacancies compared to unemployed people in a tight labour market. And it was exactly this what we found. So it was thin labour markets that were really important. So where the outside option, where maybe the female thought they couldn't just leave their job and get a new job because there wasn't the availability of outside options there, that had the biggest effect. And again, within thin labour markets, it was females who worked full-time, particularly managerial and professional occupations, who were married and had no children. So it was in these thin labour markets, it was people who had a quite a good job and there was no outside option. So they're essentially trapped into this job. They couldn't then decide to look for a different job given the constraints they had. So just to conclude the first paper, the rich longitudinal data, the great data with an understanding society, allowed us to really explore and drill down into the relationship between commuting and well-being, but importantly, to try and get some causal, or at least what we claim to be causal evidence, exploiting this notion of an exogenous shock to commuting time. And we found that females and not males were negatively affected following an increase in commute time. And that local labour markets, marital status and the presence of children all combine to make effects worse for females than for males. So the second paper looks at the relationship between commuting mode and health. So the first paper looked at commuting time and well-being. Here we're going to look at mode and health. Quite rightly, there's a lot of evidence that policymakers across the world, both local and national level, are really trying to encourage people to switch away from cars and public transport, from cars towards public transport and more active modes of commute. So there's quite a lot of very good cross-sectional evidence on the positive association between active travel or active ways of getting to work and improved health and well-being. But again, that might suffer from some of the problems I mentioned in the first paper. And we really need longitudinal evidence to get some estimates to see if these relationships hold up to changes over time. So again, just why might this be interesting? How can commuting mode possibly affect health? I think it's generally believed that sedentary modes of travel are quite bad for people's health. So for example, they can affect both physical and mental health. And from a physical health point of view, there's quite a lot of evidence now that sedentary commuting is associated with higher rates of obesity and conditions that entails. So diabetes and hypertension, for example, but also sedentary modes of commute are associated with high blood pressure. And again, commuting mode in cars and public transport to some extent is associated with worse mental health because of the stress that it can induce. Active travels, on the other hand, so walking and cycling traditionally, are associated with improvements in or better levels of physical and mental health for essentially the opposite reasons. So physical activity that is brought about through walking and cycling can lead to better physical health. It can also lead to more stimulation and relaxation, which will then improve people's mental health. And there's also obviously wider things that we don't consider brought about through reductions in air pollution. So in the long run, this would also be good for people's health because they're exposed to fewer pollutants. The Guardian and a few other people covered this story a few years ago, where this report essentially found people who use public transport mainly were more likely to eat more calories because there's lots of fast food places available at train stations, etc. So there are quite documented links between commuting mode and health. So what we do is again use the longitudinal elements of understanding society to look at changes in commuting mode and seeing if these were associated with changes in health relative to a control group of people who didn't switch their mode of travel. We argue that's important because essentially if you decide to choose to change commute mode, that is a choice, it's not random. So we need to get a comparative group of people to compare changes in health to try and abstract away from these potential problems. Again, there's a conceptual model that we use to base our empirical estimation on. So the empirical approach uses this concept of entropy balancing. So we need 3 periods of data, which Understand Society is great for because it allows us to do this and consider different times. So between periods T-1 and period T, an individual changes the way they travel to work. We then want to see if that then is associated with changes in health in a subsequent period. And we argue that this last period is important because we don't know the temporal order of things between period T-1 and period T. So a lot of the health questions asked, thinking back over the last few weeks, And the commuting mode is usually, or how do you travel to work? And it's not obvious which one would come first. So if we add this extra wave, we can try and abstract away a little bit from that. We can then use this to match people who do change modes to a control group of people who don't change mode, where we match people on age, gender, marital status, their commuting time pre-switch, their job and house characteristics pre-switch, their pre-switch health to try and make sure it's not health driving the decision to change mode, and also how long this person's been in the survey, and lots of other characteristics. We can really try and match apples with apples to make sure we're getting a control group that is as similar as possible on observable factors to the treatment group. Obviously, we can't do a lot about potential unobserved factors, but we'll just argue that matching on observables is sufficient here. Then entropy balancing is quite neat because it allows us to create a control group based on group equivalences on the means, what will traditionally happen, but also higher order moments of the distribution as well. So we can look at variance and kurtosis, skewness, etc. Because we know that two samples with the same mean can have very different distributions, so entropy balancing tries to make sure that distributions are as equivalent as possible. We can then compare the change in health between our treatment group, those who have changed mode, and the pseudo control group of people who haven't changed modes between waves. So about 95% of people who used a car to travel to work last year will also use a car this year. That is much more sort of people who use cars are much less likely to switch away than other modes. So only 81% of people who used public transport last year will still use public transport this year, and only 78% of people who use active modes last year will still use active modes this year. So unfortunately, there's more people transitioning in the wrong way, if you like. So from car to walking, it's only 3%, whereas 16% are transitioning from walking to car. That's not looking too promising from trying to get people into active modes point of view. The measure of health we use here is based on the short form 12 questionnaire, which is a series of 12 questions related to various aspects of people's health. And from that, you can create a lot of different useful measures. The two we focus on are the physical component summary and the mental component summary. So as the name suggests, the top one refers to people's physical health, and the MCS refers to people's mental health. And again, it's the same measure as the same people over time, so we can account for lots of things that might influence the way people respond to these type of questions. This is just entropy balancing on one type of switch. The entropy balancing for all the other types of switch are in the paper and the supplementary material. But before we matched, the groups were similar-ish, but not that similar. But after we do this entropy balancing, we get two very similar groups of people, those who do switch mode and those who don't. And then we look at what happens then. So what is the difference in the change in health of people who do switch mode relative to the difference in the change in health of people who don't switch mode? And if we get people to move from car to active travels, we can see that there is an increase in physical health. And again, this is predominantly driven by females. But there's substantial improvements in mental health for the whole sample. Again, it's bigger for females, but there also are positive changes in mental health following the decision to start to use active travel. If we look at the other way around, people who switch from active modes to cars, we can see that physical health goes down. And again, the result is bigger for females than it is for males. The mental health does go down, but not in a statistically significant manner. Some of the results, so the paper's got all of the different ways of switching between the two, but I'll not present them all here. But essentially, there are declines in mental health when people switch away from active travel to public transport, although there's no detectable effect of switching from public transport to active for either physical or mental health. People do say, or females in particular, do say they're more satisfied with their health following switches from public transport to more active modes. The results are quite consistent across using period T. So as I said, we focus on health in period T+1, but if we just use period T, we get quite consistent results. And also when we use period T+2 to make sure we try and get some sort of more sustained or longer term effects. Results aren't driven by seasonality, so we know that people are more likely to walk or cycle in the summer, for example. So we compare people in the summer against people in the winter. Example, the results are incredibly consistent. And then because we want at least 3 years of observations, we might suffer from attrition, but the full sample and the restricted sample are very similar on observable characteristics, and these choices don't seem to predict attrition, so we're not too concerned about potential attrition here. So the conclusion of paper 2 is that the rich longitudinal data, again, contained within Understand Society was great because it allowed us to explore this relationship between the decision to change mode and how that led to changes in people's health. We show that switching from active modes of travel to car improves mental health for males and females and physical health for females. And the opposite switches, active to car, led to reductions in physical health for females and males, although no statistically significant effect on mental health. So just to sort of conclude on the 2 papers I've discussed about, there are penalties for well-being following increases in commuting time that maybe are beyond the control of the individual. So I think we need to really argue out the case that if firms do relocate, there need to be support available, particularly to females, and particularly the type of females who are identified, to help them to manage this increased commuting time. Maybe that would be through more flexibility, for example, or whether there are more tailored forms of support. I think it is really important that we should continue to promote active modes of travel because there are benefits to health. And obviously we haven't considered the wider benefits through reduced pollution and more civic engagement, for examples. And policies here are cycle routes. So in central Manchester, there's new cycle routes being put in various places. There's now pedestrianised roads that used to be very heavily dominated by buses and cars. They're now cycle and walking only. The schemes that we saw a few years ago, where you could buy a cycle and then it would come out of your wage before taxation and stuff, that seemed to work. So we haven't evaluated these policies per se, but these type of policies would lead to shifts in the direction that we have found to be beneficial for health. And just to conclude about the data, so I am a massive fan of Understand Society. I've used it in my master's and PhD and career beyond then. But it is such a great data source and data set and resource. And without the rich longitudinal data that is within Understand Society, we wouldn't have been able to conduct this research on commuting and health and well-being. It is very rare, from what we found, to have such a large sample that is longitudinal within people, such that we can stratify the sample by characteristics, we can examine changes over time, etc. And without all of these, it wouldn't have been possible to do some of the things that we've done. So hopefully I've convinced you there are some important relationships between commuting and health and well-being, but I think this is very much scratching the surface. There are many more important and unanswered questions in this area. I think there's some brilliant presentations coming up this afternoon that try and do exactly that. So Understand Society is a great data source. It's got lots of questions on travel, lots of questions on health, and we've got all these brilliant properties that we could continue to use to our advantage as researchers to answer some of these policy relevant questions. So thank you very much.